Seeing everyone here before a long weekend, Mr. Clerk, would you please call the roll?
Councilmember Yaroslavsky.
Here.
Councilmember McCosker.
Here.
Councilmember Rahman. Councilmember Blumenfield.
Blumenfield present.
Councilmember Hernandez. You have three members, Madam Chair. You have a quorum.
Thank you. Colleagues, today we have 8 items on the agenda. We're going to hear presentations on 1, 2, and 8. I'd like to hear item 2 first and then item 1, if that's all right. They're both DWP items. I'm continuing item 3 as we're still awaiting a final city attorney report. And I would recommend that we vote on consent items 4, 5, 6, and 7. On item 7, is Ms. Starr present? Great. I want to acknowledge and thank Ms. Starr for her willingness to serve. Without objection, that will be the order. Mr. Clerk, will you please confirm?
Certainly, Madam Chair. Councilmember Yaroslavsky.
Yes.
Councilmember McCosker.
Yes.
Would you like to take public comment first,
Before
Madam
we
Chair,
vote?
before we vote?
Sure. So, okay. So we're going to, on consent, we're going to vote on items 4, 5, 6, and 7, right? Okay, so we're now ready to receive public comments. Ms. Cadigan-Hurd, please, would you mind reading instructions on how to give public comment, please?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Members of the public will have 1 minute per item to speak, up to 2 minutes total, and 1 minute for general public comment. We will tell you when your time is up. When speaking on the agenda items, you must be on topic. Our goal is to get through as many speakers as we can. If you are not speaking on topic, or if we cannot tell whether you are speaking on a specific agenda item, you will get one brief warning from me or the chair. If you do not immediately get clearly on topic, or again stray off topic, the chair will cut you off and you will forfeit the rest of your speaking time, and we will move on to the next speaker. Thank you.
So, first speaker is not a real name, Abronafricatown. Anyone here with that name? Okay, and then the second person who signed up used vulgarities. I'm not going to say it. So, great. Moving on. Wonderful. I see no more speakers in the queue, unless you see more, Madam City Attorney.
Lizette Castillo.
We're not seeing that. Would you call the name? I'm not seeing that on my...
Yeah, just ask if there's anybody here to speak, and that'll cover you.
Is there anybody else here to speak during public comment? Great, come on up.
Hi, which items would you like to speak on?
Item 1.
Okay, you have 1 minute.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Lisette Castillo, and I'm a senior at Wilson High School and an official representative for Mentor for Change, an organization that offers career-based mentoring. And having aspirations to become an environmental engineer, it was clear to me that in my research that would pertain to environmental disparities within Los Angeles. While conducting research, an obstacle that I encountered was a lack of available data on water quality. And this has sparked me to join today's meeting to address LAWP's budget, specifically in data publication. The state and LAWP has done an adequate job at addressing the problems associated with water quality. However, I believe that current aggregated data isn't accessible to most populations of LA, such as the various Spanish speakers such as myself. I think that there is more to be done when publishing data that could absolutely consider the demographic you are working for. Ultimately, I ask that this committee support data transparency and encourage officials to increase the budget that goes into data publication so that all members of our community can have the opportunity to learn about their water quality and systems. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Castillo. Barbara Hensley?
Good afternoon. I'm Barbara Hensley, and I am a volunteer with the Sierra Club. I'm the chair of...
Excuse me, what items would you like to speak on?
I'm sorry, item 5.
Okay. you have 1 minute.
Okay, thank you. And I'm the volunteer chair of the Central Group, which is the LA area. But I'm here today because I was asked by the California Sierra Club to be here representing its 500,000 members to talk on item 5 and just encourage the committee to pass that. We're kind of delayed on the implementation of SB 1383, and we want to get that done here in LA. And it's good for food waste, to divert grocery store items into food banks. It's good for conservation because we are able to, instead of using pesticides, we can convert this into compost and use it in agriculture, and it's generally good for the environment. So I encourage you all to pass it, and thank Councilmember Yaroslavsky for introducing it. Take care.
Thank you very much, Ms. Hensley. So that's it. I see no more speakers in the queue. We're going to close public comment. We're ready to vote on consent items 4, 5, 6, and 7. I move approval, and without objection, Mr. Clerk, will you please call the roll?
Certainly, Madam Chair. Councilmember Yaroslavsky.
Yes.
Councilmember McOsker.
Yes.
Councilmember Rahman. Councilmember Blumenfield.
Blumenfield, aye.
Councilmember Hernandez. You have 3 ayes, and the consent items are approved.
Great, thank you. Turning to item 2 first. CLA, would you please read the item?
Item number 2 is a joint mayor, city council, and controller report relative to the Industrial, Economic, and Administrative Survey of the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power pursuant to Charter Section 266A. We have members from Guidehouse as the authors of the report to join us.
Thank you very much. Colleagues, welcome, first of all. This is a presentation by the consultant firm Guidehouse relative to an independent industrial, economic, and administrative survey of LADWP. It's required by charter every 5 years. It's a joint review effort by the mayor, city council, and controller. I'll note we're a bit off the normal schedule given the pandemic. I want to thank our presenters who traveled from very far away to be with us here today. This review is supposed to provide an independent and outside perspective on the whole of DWP, so it covers quite a lot. I'm going to ask our presenters to please introduce yourselves, and then we'll get started.
Very good. Thank you, Madam Chair. I am Chris Rogers. I'm a partner with Guidehouse leading up the Western United States for our energy practice. And with me, I have my colleagues Chris Lurish to the left, who is a partner at Guidehouse as well, covering off on a number of the key areas that we'll be discussing today. And to my right, Mr. Gene Schlatz, who has also been very participatory in the engagement and will be a subject matter expert presenting on a couple of the segments. Thank you.
Wonderful. So I know there's a lot to cover, but if we can try and limit it to just over 10 minutes, that would be great.
I've got my timer here. I'm going to try to keep us true.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris.
Just for context, to follow on, build on to what you said, the scope of the IEA was to really focus on these 4 key areas: strategic planning, physical infrastructure, security, engineering, preparedness, and IT, shared services, and also taking a look at the key performance indicators that the business utilizes to monitor and measure the current state and operations of the business. There are a number of contextual points that should be made clear that relate to the current operating environment that certainly affects LADWP, as well, I would say more broadly, as the industry is going through a significant transformation as we adopt clean energy coast to coast, north and south. For the sake of this discussion, some key external challenges relate to sustainability targets and regulatory requirements. Here, this is a lot around the goal to get to LA 100 initiatives of clean energy, really living with certain climate impact changes, whether those are wildfires, extreme temperatures that haven't been experienced before, and then ever-growing physical and cybersecurity threats that have even, very recently been in the news with the latest state actors working to thwart power delivery across the nation, just as of yesterday. And our customers' expectations are changing dramatically. So those are key external challenges that require change, catalyze change within LEDWP and similars across the country, as well as lastly, the internal challenges of an aging infrastructure that is, at times challenged to address current needs and certainly the future electrified environments. Lots of large programs beyond that are transformative beyond kind of business as usual make the job ever more challenging. And then getting the right types of skills. There are new skills that have never necessarily been the core purview of utilities that they're finding required for a much more distributed and digitalized future. And then certainly making sure that we can do this in a way that people can afford and keep the organization financially healthy. Overarching themes, and we'll dive into the meat of our findings and recommendations. This is really true for LADWP and again across the industry. Digitalization, digital instrumentation, and automation of the grid, large capital programs to really support the transition of two things, replacing aging infrastructure, but also achieving clean energy goals, and doing so in a way that is equitable for all of the constituents across the geography. What is also true is that there is a ever collapsing space between both what have been core operations and new digitalization and IT infrastructures. That is a challenge for every major utility, and finding all the capable hands. You're competing, LADWP is competing with other utilities as well as other industries now for the right talent. With that, I'd like to turn the discussion over to Mr. Gene Schlatt to talk us through the findings and recommendations around water and power, and then we'll move on to two other areas.
Thank you, Chris. One thing I want to highlight with regard to our assessment, both water and on the power side, we essentially evaluated two aspects of the department's plans. One, we looked at the long-term strategic plan in terms of the adequacy of the water supply and power as well. Then we took a closer, more near-term look at the condition of the assets, the physical assets, the processes and programs in place to ensure adequacy and reliability of the systems serving both water and power. But starting with the water side on the strategic end of things, clearly the department has set forth a very comprehensive plan over the short and long term, if you will, to ensure adequate supply to the city water consumers, with a clear focus on transitioning from reducing reliance on imports and relying more so on local supply. But that's combined with very aggressive programs for reduced water usage, energy conservation, combined with things such as enhanced water reclamation, stormwater retention. So taken together, a very well thought out plan for ensuring short and long-term water supply. Now, along with that, as Chris mentioned, there's some challenges with that, of course. It's a very significant program with many different elements to it, requiring very comprehensive skills needs, both field forces as well as technical resources. So that represents a challenge looking forward. So I would emphasize that one of the key findings is the need for attention to staffing requirements, again, both from a field, need for increased outside contractor type support, both on the technical and implementation end. With regard to physical assets, we found that the department has implemented programs, strategies, asset management techniques for ensuring that the condition of its assets are indeed in good shape and are capable of performing their required functions. There are some opportunities in terms of things such as related to the data condition assessment of the assets. Some assets perhaps are in need of a near-term replacement. For example, large valves are one of them. On the other hand, the mains and main trunk lines for delivering the water seems to be in good shape with regard to the condition assessment and the determination of the adequacy of those assets. So with that, I'm going to turn our attention to the power side. Again, to recap, a lot of long-term challenges with regard to the water system, but again, the department has laid forth a well-thought-out plan for ensuring the adequacy of water supply, which over time will actually reduce the required per capita consumption. On the power side, similar challenges. Since our last report, one of the major changes we've identified is transitioning from one where there was continued reliance on thermal resources such as natural gas. Our current plan calls for, essentially going to 100% renewables as well as non-carbon by year 2035. That's a very aggressive goal. A lot needs to be done with the power system, both with regard to the power generation resources to ensure that they're available and can maintain system reliability. The power delivery system, both the transmission and distribution, are going to require significant enhancements to be able to accommodate the large amounts of renewable power, both within the basin and from external imports, to be able to maintain the reliability, security, and operability of the system. Similar to water, additional skills are needed, both with regard to the transition of this system to one of predominantly renewables, as well as operational technology systems to be able to manage a more diverse set of resources, both local as well as outside of the state. So the strategic long-term plan has been updated and outlines very important measures that need to be undertaken to be able to achieve those goals. Clearly, they can be met if all those objectives are met, but there are indeed challenges that are associated with those plans. And with regard to wildfire mitigation, I'll turn over to my colleague, Chris Flores.
Thank you, Gene. With respect to wildfire mitigation, this is a very new sort of, it isn't new concepts in terms of mitigating risk and wildfire risk, but lots of new regulations, lots of new rules, lots of new technology. What we note basically is the maturing of a wildfire program and a wildfire overall, management of that program with metrics and GRC tools and really kind of taking that, taking the way we manage wildfire mitigation to a next level of maturity. And this really applies globally to all the POUs and IOUs and power companies in California and beyond, as this is a continuing risk that's not going away. So overall, just kind of moving towards a more mature wildfire mitigation program. I will address the security and emergency preparedness that we looked at in water and power. I'll focus on the key findings here, starting with workforce development. And we note that in the security space, at the time, a year and a half ago when we were conducting these interviews and doing our analysis, key positions were filled. But nevertheless, hiring security professionals in our industry is tough. There's a shortage of cybersecurity trained individuals in the world, and they're typically, more going into tech and other areas, and getting them into power is a challenge. So, what our industry and what DWP is faced with is the continual recruiting, training, and retaining employees that we struggle with it. Everybody struggles with it. So what we recommend is really a core competency in training and development, and bringing folks that might not be cybersecurity trained, but developing those in-house is something that will benefit DWP. With respect to emergency management and business continuity planning, we noted maturity in those programs. Some were still in the process. With respect to security, though, the mindset is there's no finish line. So what we noted here is the continual assessment and improvement will drive sustainability and will drive security progress in the future as threats continue to mount every day. And it's important to continually assess and improve and mitigate those risks on an annual basis. With respect to documentation and cross-functional collaboration, it's also important to note when we look at the maturity of security and the maturity of your program, there are areas that can be better documented. There are areas that can have more defined processes in an annual review, and that's how we improve, right? That's how we're going to be able to identify, continuously assess, and document the processes. We believe there is some sort of work to do in that area as well, to take that program to the next level. We noted the ETAS contract will help improve contracting, and at this, again, a year and a half ago, it's in its early stage, that would provide sort of third-party help and provide it quickly as needed. I think it's important, and this goes with IT as well, we understand the challenges with staff augmentation and hiring third parties. We understand the union concerns, but there are areas that where in a DWP where staff is fully utilized on a particular project, right? And if somebody leaves, they're unable to get that job done. So it's important to cross-train, have backup support, and really, rely on those vendors in the critical risk areas if needed. And this vehicle does, as we noted, provide some of that flexibility. With respect to IT support and administration, we did note long lead times for new employees and an inability for staff augmentation, as I mentioned. Having that, relying on those contracts and relying on your core competency of training and development in the IT space is critically important. We noted that at the time the new CITO was implementing improvements and understanding that a lot of that stuff over the last year and a half, things have progressed. We think it's important also to have a look both in IT and in cybersecurity across power, water, and joint, and to really kind of orchestrate some of those improvements together and not just do improvements in a vacuum. We think that will lead to efficiencies. It will lead to eliminating some duplication of costs and work effort, and it would certainly eliminate some of the security risk that exists in working in silos. DWP would benefit from, as we mentioned here again, temporary SMEs for a defined set of circumstances, and our recommendation is really kind of focused on understanding your critical risk areas and understanding where you might not have the capacity to mitigate risk, and if somebody leaves, how are you going to protect your infrastructure? So it's very important to have an eye overall of where your security risks are and where you can best allocate your resources. Turn the time over back to Chris now.
And this will be our final slide. The last piece of the assessment was to evaluate the key metrics that each of these 4 areas were utilizing to measure and operate the business, and whether or not those were sufficient and adequate. And the net out of it is, by and large, they had actually recently been updated just before the beginning of the survey. And there were a couple of recommendations, two new metrics within power, a new metric within water, and joint and equity were recently defined and did not need, in our view, any additions. And that concludes our summary.
Thank you very much for that quick presentation. I want to point out that the report highlights a bunch of areas where DWP has made progress and is doing leading edge work, and so I want to thank you and DWP for those advancements. I have some questions and then we'll turn to colleagues, but I'd love for someone from DWP, maybe Matt, to come up, or whoever, in case you're better suited to answer the question. So I'm going to start on the power side. Since the report came out, we've had some pretty big wet weather events this winter on the power side of the house. It caused outages, the power pole, emergency repairs. Which of the recommendations that you all made would you say speak most to our opportunity to address our aging power system infrastructure?
Yes, one of the key features of the plan is a much higher reliance on local energy sources, solar, batteries. At the same time, we're expecting to see significant growth with the electrical growth, especially in the building sector and electric vehicles. So the existing system, parts of it are aging. They're deemed to be somewhat older, maybe deemed to be obsolete. The lower voltage systems, they're not quite as capable of carrying as much power. So significant enhancements are needed to the so-called distribution system to be able to accommodate the additional load, to be able to accommodate these new non-traditional resources. So a lot of attention needs to be placed there. Efforts are underway also to enhance and upgrade the transmission system, basically to be able to increase the transfer capability to be able to bring in more renewable power. A lot of those plans are underway or plans are in place to be able to enhance the system, but we would point out a significant number of high voltage transmission upgrades are going to be needed to be able to reach the 2035 goals. So it's an effort both on the transmission and distribution side. Significant enhancements are required, and a lot of them are needed in a relatively short period of time. And when we begin thinking about transmission, the lead time on transmission projects can be anywhere from 5 to 7 years, sometimes longer. So having well thought out plans in place to be able to accomplish the completion of those projects is going to be so essential to meeting the 2035 goals.
Thank you. Lots of ways to make our system more resilient. So on page 56 of the report, it talks about using active asset management as a way to improve power system performance while increasing renewable energy and distributed energy resources. At previous meetings, we've heard from the public about the urgency of better addressing the expansion of those distributed resources. So I want to get more detail here. Can you describe what you mean by active asset management and tell us what you think are the changes that are needed at DWP to make it happen?
Well, this sort of goes hand in hand with the comments I just made. Active asset management is maybe another way of looking at getting better utilization, better optimization of assets, more targeted spending, and increasing the basically effectiveness of the use of the assets. But it does go hand in hand with the upgrading of the power delivery system, both transmission and distribution, ensuring that the assets which are being upgraded or replaced are considering those longer-term needs with regard to the renewable, local, as well as out-of-state sources. So when we think about active management, targeting the spending on areas where we're going to get the most capability in terms of meeting those objectives for renewables and non-carbon sources. So that's really a way of looking at active management, is ensuring that we're enabling or getting the most out of those assets that we can for a certain level of spending. But it does go hand in hand very much so with the need for upgrading the transmission and distribution system, but making good decisions and trying to get more out of those assets and be able to accommodate these new non-traditional sources.
Great. Just one more question on the power side. So I was glad to see that one of the slides talked about DWP's activities in reducing wildfire risk. That's great. Of course, it only takes one spark to cause serious problems, and that's a concern in my district and many others. I saw that in the report you had additional recommendations on how to even further shore up our wildfire safety. On page 72, the report talks about categorizing risk using a wildfire risk register tracking mechanism to enable optimal decision-making practices for future risk spending. Could you go into a little more detail about what that could look like? I'd be interested in some examples of how we could improve transparency for the public on wildfire mitigation investments.
Yeah, I'll address that. When we looked at the wildfire mitigation program, we believe taking a risk lens in applying a risk management framework in terms of how you allocate your investment and how you allocate your resources. I think it's as simple as that in applying a methodology to really rank risk and register that risk, and then direct your attention and your funds and your investment based on the risk ratings.
Okay.
Did that?
It's I just lost the microphone. Could you give some examples of what that might look like?
So it could be from a territory perspective. You'll have separate regions that of course very simply will have higher risk based on the vegetation. So it would be based on area. It would be based on the vegetation state of that particular region, and it would start there. But it would have a methodology to really rank that risk and prioritize where you want to spend your time versus everybody is applying the same level of risk mitigation to every area.
Right, okay. So it seems like it would be sort of intuitive, just based on hillsides where there's a lot of brush, things like that. Okay.
Population areas.
Okay, two quick questions on water. Can you walk us through how your key recommendations on water relate to Operation Next?
Okay, well, that's, yeah, with Operation Next, that's a longer-term program, so the key takeaway here is, you know, given that there's a significant amount of investment, a lot of infrastructure required, and it's intended to address the potential risk of things basically moving out in time. In other words, there need to be backup resources, whether it be underground storage facilities, in the event that the Operation Next program are not completed, perhaps in the time frame as expected. So given the climate change, variability on water flows and such, having plans in place such that it can mitigate the potential risk of certain aspects of the Operation Next not moving as forward as quickly. It's longer term, and there's, you know, our evaluation really goes out more to the 2035, 2040 timeframe. We realize Operation Next goes beyond that, but there are elements along the way that need to be completed. If we're finding that, for example, things are proceeding at a slower pace, that need to be able to have alternatives in place in the event that certain aspects of Operation Next don't proceed as expected. So it's basically a mitigation or a risk mitigation plan in place to be able to address that possibility.
Okay, great. And just one more question. Knowledge capture from retirements. Notice this was a recurring theme from the last 2015 survey. Retirements in the asset management team, water operations, water distribution divisions. This is more of a question for you, Matt. But have we made progress on that, given the figure in the report that 30% of the water system staff was eligible for retirement as of 2020?
Yeah, so our general manager and our chief operating officer, Marty Adams and R.M. Benjamin, have embarked on an effort to sort of identify the bottlenecks within the system that are impeding our ability to hire as quickly as we need to in order to have, you know, succession planning in place. So you need two ingredients to hire in a civil service context. One is lists with certified candidates that are active that you can pick from and conduct interviews. And the next is just the ability to conduct those interviews and pick those candidates off the list quickly enough before the list expires. And so one of the bottlenecks that we've identified, for example, is some divisions hire from the same list within the department, and they do that in succession rather than concurrently. And so there are some parts of the department that do that really effectively, and they all, you know, kind of bundle them together concurrently and hire all at the same time. Others, we need to kind of have a culture change where there's not sort of a departmental competition for candidates, that they're all kind of hiring together and then picking the appropriate candidates for those jobs. So we don't have results to report on that yet. We're still kind of identifying all of them. The first ingredient I mentioned may actually require some intervention by the council with the personnel department to make sure that we're getting candidate lists certified as quickly as we need them, and that sort of feeds the machine.
Okay, great. Let us know if we can help.
I certainly will be reporting back.
Colleagues, any questions? Mr. McCosker, Mr. Bloomfield?
I have a couple.
Just general, thank you very much, appreciate it. The slides and the materials have a number of areas where we come back to the constraints or the challenges being the ability to quickly hire, the ability to augment staff, the ability to have subject matter experts ready at a moment's notice. And a number of the comments come back to, well, we can't do it because of union constraints, which kind of implies a static relationship. I mean, can I have some observations on how we would negotiate around some of those issues? Because it's not fair to say we can't get there from here. There always has to be a path.
Yeah, and I would say that everything is improved by better communication, right? We need to have a bi-directional relationship with the union where they're raising concerns with us, but then we're also taking the concerns back to them. And I think that there is, to a degree, a sense of, well, we can't change that. It's just how it's always been, right? And particularly our GM and our board chair are both kind of committed to stopping doing the things that don't work. And so I don't have any specific recommendations for you at the moment, but what I will say is that there's a degree of bureaucratic sort of inertia development that needs to happen so that we just kind of get a better process in place and then keep making progress in communicating with the union
Yeah, and some of it might also be coming to personnel practices that are entirely within management's control.
Right.
I mean, and school me a little bit, Matt, on, you have a personnel department, you also rely on the personnel function over on this side of the street, right? How does that relationship work?
So, one example of another bottleneck that we've sort of identified in the personnel process is that our personnel analysts are at personnel department. They're not in the department. And so,
Right.
By co-locating, we might be able to get better results out of that hiring process and kind of smooth over some of those union inefficiencies or the civil service inefficiencies. They're not really union inefficiencies.
Are there things we could do, I mean, looking at management rights and sort of management practices, are there things we could do, again, here in these chambers or these meeting rooms at the Personnel Committee to talk about practices and improving practices to speed up the hiring time, speed up the opportunity from application to onboarding?
Yes, I don't have a list of those ready right now because we're in the process of developing that at the moment, and I'm working with Michael D'Andrea, who's our HR person, not the personnel department person, to identify where those areas of inefficiency might be, and we have every intention of bringing them back to you before, and rather than suffer in silence.
Great. It strikes me that a lot, maybe I'll ask your observations, a lot of the paths to improvement are related to being able to fill personnel positions and refill positions as they come open and develop subject matter experts.
Yeah, if I could, I would say just across industry too, I think it's definitely not an easy problem to solve, but, and not one, it's kind of silver bullet, but probably a number of lead bullets together that get us there. And some of it, shortening hiring time is part of the answer. But what's ahead of us is also should be considered because, when we're talking about, in just in the LA Basin getting to, realizing the key objectives of LA 100, that almost demands creating, taking time and creating early incubator systems to, go out to all communities here at an early stage, and even in high school, and start recruiting and having incubator camps to bring, and I know that sounds like so far away, but it is really what it's probably going to take to get to realize, LA 100 and beyond in 2035, getting, the youth engaged and excited to become part of, the mission here, and in many different roles. Some of the roles are the prototypical ones that LEDWP and other utilities have been hiring for 100 plus years, and you still need more of those. And then there are a whole litany of new roles you've never had before, utilities never had before, absolutely required. And that process, if you could step in the Wayback Machine, you just started that 5 years ago. And and again, that is not unique to LEDWP, but also true here and every other utility.
It's not unique to utilities either.
It is not
It's the
unique
same
to-
thing as the case for police and fire and sanitation and everything we do. So, thank you very much.
Councilmember Blumenfield.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this report. A lot of interesting stuff in here. Couple of things. One thing jumped out when you're talking about Operation Next, that the date is 2058, which I know is complicated and how that all comes in. But what are the constraints there? And if we wanted to expedite this to make it happen in our lifetime, make it happen faster, what do we need to do?
That's something I think we do. That's a pretty complex question, and we assess the aspects of Operation Next in terms of being able to provide a secure water supply. That's something we'd have to take under advisement, I think. I'm not sure I have a ready answer on that one.
And if I could just ask to clarify, is the ask, how could the key objectives of Operation Next be accomplished in a shorter time horizon?
Yeah, I mean, it's
How much more
it's
time
so
do we have?
important. I know it's complicated.
Right.
And the report talks about it as 2058. I always had it on in my mental understanding, I had it on a shorter time horizon, and because we see countries like Israel are doing it to some extent, and we've seen this effort. Technology is also changing. I mean, probably by 2058, we will be able to, take water out of the air and produce it more economically. I know that's already being done. It's being done over at the Staples or at the
Right.
Crypto or whatever we're calling it now, to make the ice. And it's, so in some ways, if we wait till 2058, technology may have surpassed it, and that infrastructure may not make financial sense anymore. So I just wondered if there's things that we can do to speed that up, to get those goals to happen faster.
I would say, I would offer, some of them are not, some of those things are not dissimilar to the things that we've talked about, mostly kind of in relation to power, but it's, about getting the right capable hands and people. That's a big, recurring theme, whether we're talking about water or power. That doesn't fully answer the question, though, and I think if we could, we'll take that question back just to give some good thought to, okay, here, what would our thoughts be on the 5 key things to accelerate and achieve key tenets of Operation Next?
Okay, different line of questions. The report talks about the enormous expenditures that we're going to need to do all this. But then it also talks about how we don't want to impose excessive tax burdens on low-income customers.
Yeah.
And given Prop 218 and some of those legal restraints, what are the tools that we have to make that possible, to make those expenditures without creating that burden? Do we have to go back to the state to change that, or are there things that you guys have come up with, ways, incentive programs that can work within the legal confines of 218 and the other legal restraints to be able to make those expenditures without creating the burden on the low income?
That is a question of strong import and probably some debate too. There's certainly a number of things that can be done within the confines of the existing regulations and laws. There also should be some consideration given to how do you change that legal framework to give you more flexibility in rate structure and funding structure, as well as, entertaining public-private partnerships along that way. That are things that you couldn't do really underneath the, constraints of Prop 218 as an example.
Okay. I also wanted to ask about in the report, it talks about the need for energy, that we'll have, I think, where was it? I was looking at it, it was like by a certain year, we're going to have 1,700 megawatts of solar and storage. And storage has always been the holy grail for renewables, right? And so what are our assumptions in terms of how we're actually going to store that energy by those years? And is there more that we need to be doing on that front?
I think, candidly, we need to go back and see what those assumptions were from a year and a half ago that we put in there. But I would say storage in general, to your point, it has been the holy grail and is what has been what creates the stabilization of otherwise intermittent green energy sources. And that has just, even in the short period of time, that technology, just even in the short period of time since that report was concluded, has advanced tremendously. And so there are a number of, there's a number of ways to store energy, but, battery storage is probably the predominant theme there. And there are a number of things that examples we could share of both technologies and pilot programs that are achieving substantial results in the state of California, up and down the state of California, as well as outside the state of California. I think that is becoming less academic and a lot more real, and at a cost point that makes it feasible.
But in the assumptions in terms of what's there in the report, are we assuming that we'll have better storage, or were we making these assumptions based on the storage that we have?
And we do always put in a technology maturity curve consideration in these reports. We just in both in our research and our experience, there are certain assumptions that go into, storage capacity, density improvements, and battery storage as an example, and other things that are contemplated. The specifics that were used in that report, those specific assumptions, I don't have at my fingertips here, but we can get for you.
Okay, great. Thank you.
All right, seeing no more questions, we're going to, thank you very much. First of all, I really appreciate you being here. I know you traveled from far away. Thanks, Matt. We're going to consider this item noted and filed, and again, thank you for being here. We're going to turn now to item 1. So if,
Item number
I
1,
think we have Ann Santilli, the CFO at DWP. So could you please read item 1?
sure. Item number 1 is a Board of Water and Power Commissioners Report and Resolution number 0230162 and 023163 relative to the preliminary fiscal year 2023-24 LADWP budget.
Wonderful. Welcome, Ms. Santilli. I know the DWP Commission recently reviewed and adopted the final budget, but due to timing, we're hearing about the preliminary budget today. So, Ms. Santilli, as part of your presentation, can you point out any big or noteworthy changes from the preliminary budget to the final budget?
Yes,
Thank you.
Good morning, I'm Ann Santilli, the Department Chief Financial Officer.
Can you bring the mic a little closer? Much closer.
So for fiscal year 23-24, the Department of Water and Power presented a preliminary budget of $8,633.5 million to the Board of Water and Power Commissioners on March 14th, 2023, and a final budget of $8,644.2 million on May 23rd, with the power system contributing $4.18 billion, the water system contributing $1.05 billion, and the joint system contributing $3.41 billion. And the joint system consists of all of the service organizations that support water and power, including our information technology group, our meter services and field operations staff, financial services, and supply chain services. Major changes from the preliminary budget to the final budget included increasing our annual personnel resolution from 13,456 to 13,713. The majority of the increase is 149 positions in the meter services and field operations, 81 positions in security, 12 positions in supply chain services, and 15 in our retirement office. There was also some staffing realignment to move energy efficiency solutions and security planning and engineering from the joint organization to the power system. This resulted in a net increase of $11 million from the preliminary budget due to these staffing increases, smoothing out our bond interest and redemption costs, while also reducing some contract spend to more realistic levels. One of the other things that was done, as was done in previous years, was we reviewed the costs recovered through our base rates to determine if any of these costs qualify for pass-through rate recovery. We identified $373 million, or 9% of the power system base rate costs, and a little less than 1% of the water base rate costs for movement. We did not review overhead costs that are fully recovered through the base rates. With the changes in the annual personnel resolution, the total power system staffing in the APR is 6,054 positions, water system of 2,521, and the joint organization of 5,045 positions. What is reflected in our budget, though, is our funded positions, realizing not all positions will be occupied. And the last column on this shows our actual staffing as of the end of March, which demonstrates that we have approximately 800 more positions budgeted than we have currently. And we normally grow about 300 positions a year, so we do have headroom to grow. The proposed final budget included the 11,848 funded full-time positions, as well as $57.7 million in daily exempt labor funding. The totals are $2,779.3 million, with labor costs of $1.6 billion, overtime of $317 million, and benefits of $846 million. which is our pension and our medical costs. And compared to prior year, this is approximately 15% above what was approved in the 22-23 budget. Looking at the power system contributions, the largest expenditure incurred is fuel and purchase power costs, which is $1.6 billion, or 39% of power systems contributing costs. The second largest expense is labor of 24%, and the third largest is contracting at 22%. A little further down is our fleet materials and supplies of $137.7 million. Of that, $19.6 million is for electric vehicles, which is expected to fund 154 vehicles. And our current sedans in our fleet are 70% plug-in. And with this year's budget, if assuming all expenditures are incurred, we should be at 78% by the end of 2024. Looking at the water system's contributions, contracting cost is the largest expense with 35% in the proposed spending, labor 32%, and purchase water costs are 16%. On the joint organization spending, our bond interest and redemption is our largest cost of 36% of our proposed budget. Labor is the second largest cost at 17% of the budget. And then retirement, including death benefits funding, contracts, and healthcare payments, all are approximately 12% each of the joint proposed budget. One of the things that we like to do is we like to look at our customer benefits programs. So for the proposed final budget, we have $184 million in energy efficiency programs, $128 million of electric transportation programs, $17 million of power system incentives, which is our thermostat demand response program, $25 million in water conservation program costs, and $4 million for our emission reduction grant program. These are all the costs that are contributed by our each organization within the power system and the water system in joint. But looking at it from a capital and operations perspective, for fiscal year 23-24, we have a proposed final budget of $2,168 million for power system capital expenditures, with the largest of that being for the power system reliability program. And that is expected to fund 3,700 pole replacements, 12,600 cross arms, and 1,255 transformer replacements. Following power system reliability, we see that the renewable portfolio standard, which are our assets that provide green power, are $409 million. Operating support, which is the cost of our joint organization capital, at $366 million. Infrastructure, which is our other generating assets, of $362 million, and then our energy efficiency program of $163 million. From an operation and maintenance perspective, our proposed final budget is $1,695 million, again with the largest piece of operating support of $644 million, power system reliability of $605 million, infrastructure of $382 million, and our power system renewable portfolio standard operation and maintenance of $64 million. Our fuel and purchase power budget is $1,615 million. This is expected to deliver 53% of renewable power during fiscal year 23-24. When we take all of these costs and information, we put it into our financial plan summary. So this budget is supported by a retail revenue sales of 22,251 gigawatt hours of energy, a revenue requirement of $4,870 million, operating and maintenance expenses of $1,695 million, with total operating expenses of $4,178 million. We'll have other expenses of $373 million to give us a positive change in our net position of $319 million. This is supported by a system average rate for kilowatt hour sales of 22 cents and borrowing of $422 million. We also like to look at how our costs compare to peer utilities. So we benchmark ourselves every January and July. And as of January 2023, 23, assuming a customer uses 500 kilowatt hours of power, the average bill is $96 a month as of this last January, which shows that we're much lower than the investor-owned utilities and basically align with other publicly owned utilities. Looking at the water revenue fund, for fiscal year 23-24, we have a proposed capital plan of $929 million, which the largest piece is our infrastructure, and that is planning to support 225,000 feet of main line replacement and 6,900 feet of trunk line replacement, followed by $200 million of water quality capital investments, operating support of $134 million, water supply of $82 million, and our Owens Valley regulatory capital expending of $49 million. From an operation and maintenance perspective, the proposed budget is $715 million, with operating support of $185 million, water quality of $169 million of operating support, infrastructure, water supply, and then the least is the Owens Valley regulatory at $51 million. For the water system, looking at the financial plan summary, this spending is supported by 190.4 million 100 cubic feet of water, that's the billing unit for water, with a revenue requirement of $1,617 million. Total operating expenses of $1,163 million, other income expenses of $128 million, for a change in the water system's net position of $326 million. And this is supported by a system average rate of $8.63 and borrowing of $377 million during the year. On the water side, our system average rate, assuming a residential customer uses 10 billing units per month, our bill is $83 compared to similarly situated utilities. Our budget was approved by our Board of Water and Power Commissioners on May 23rd. For the remainder of this month, we're working on transmitting that to the Mayor's Office, the Council, and relevant stakeholders. And our next steps is to present our pass-through rate adjustments to our board in June for the beginning of fiscal year July 1st of 2023. And that is the end of my presentation.
Great, thank you so much. I understand, Dr. Pickle, you're here with a short presentation. Can you come forward and the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. I'm Fred Pickle, Office of Public Accountability Executive Director, and my comments are on the DWP proposed budget for 23-24, and we support this budget, and we also support the approval of the changes in recovery method for certain 23-24 expenditures, and because of changes in the environment that necessitate these expenses, things like the climate impacts and increased and more uncertain rain, and the challenges in fixing these issues this past spring. And as Ann Santilli noted, additional alignment work is in progress for next year. Now, estimates in terms of rate impacts are uncertain because rates are adjusted based on sales, and sales are uncertain. We don't have a final number yet for this fiscal year, and the budget forecasts growth next fiscal year, but there's been a lot of uncertainty in these forecasts over the past few years. The budget and pass-through changes as proposed are reasonable, although there's substantial uncertainty in the impacts. The integration of the budget discussion, combining all system elements into the DWP strategic plan framework, was a welcome addition, and and the budget sets some difficult spending goals, and DWP has had challenges in stepping up staff and vendors quickly. And the lack of a rate review since 2015-16 is a fundamental financial, operational, governance, and transparency issue. We would like to look at, and can barely see, the spending changes over the last couple of years. If we look at spending proposed for this year, mostly completed versus the prior year, DWP has been successful in stepping up spending in most categories. If we look at performance of how they're doing versus their approved budget, they haven't quite made their goals in all areas, but they have been successful in stepping up. And in the water system, because of reduction of water costs, I assume, they're having cost declines. In some categories for next year, there are big step-ups, especially in the joint system. Some of that reflects financing, but other components we think they'll have a hard time making. And then the power system has come through a period where they've upped spending by over 15%. And are 9.5% above budget. This year, they're backing off to a 3% increase for this coming year. So what can they do? They've been successfully stepping up in most areas. How are they doing? Okay. Can they do it for next year? There's certainly one stretch increase. That's the end of my presentation. Are there questions?
I don't have any questions for Dr. Beckel. Do either of you?
General questions, yeah.
Sure, I have questions for Ms. Santilli. In the first few slides, you noted the increase in total number of personnel positions, almost 2/3 of which are for meter service and field operations. With the department shifting towards smart meters, how are these positions going to transition as labor needs change?
That is something we're going to have to work on with our labor partners, but our field operations and our customer service director realized that we needed some additional help in the field until we make that transition. So we needed to hire those, or allow us to hire those staff to do that work, and then we'll work with our labor partners and others on that transition.
Okay, great. Just two more quick questions. So, and I'm not sure if you know this, maybe Matt, you have this answer, but what % renewable portfolio is contemplated in the estimated power system supply costs? That might be for someone other than you.
For this coming year, it's 53%.
Oh, great.
I think the current year, I think it's 44%.
Oh, great. So we're moving in the right direction.
Yes.
One
Excellent.
addition to that is if you look at clean energy, it looks like they will surpass 70% clean energy this year.
Okay, great.
And
that includes
once
natural
the
gas,
IPP
is that the idea?
Once the IPP coal plant is retired in 2025, we'll probably be above 80.
Okay. Great. So how much of the transition to 100% renewable energy and LA 100 in Operation Next is contemplated in this capital expenditure plan?
So there were a lot of costs in LA 100 for our distribution plant that wasn't in there. So that's our power system reliability program. So there's a lot of distribution infrastructure investments in there, and we're continuing to study LA 100 by looking at our LA equity strategies to make sure that when we do move forward, that costs, benefits, and burdens are distributed equally.
Okay, great. Colleagues? Councilmember Blumenfield.
Couple of questions. One, just a very technical question, and then some more general ones. But when you're looking, I was looking in the report about it said net retail sales. How is that dealing with the solar, buyback? So on my roof, of course, I have net metering, and people have that across the city. How is that accounted for? Is that the net you're talking about, or is it?
So if there's solar on a customer's roof, it would just be the sales that we get, that we deliver to them only.
So
And if
you're not
it's-
subtracting out what you're buying, essentially.
Correct, I'm not, that would be that would be netted in there. So my overall, if you used 10 and you supplied 8 and I gave you 2, I would just be looking at the 2.
Got it, okay. And then, a couple things, the DWP report reported to the council on the status of the multi-power pole maintenance and exposure. And, you know, with some of the poles that are rotting and causing issues, does this budget significantly invest resources, equipment, personnel toward the power pole infrastructure? Are we gonna have, you know, we just paid out a liability in a recent case, a horrible case. Do we have enough funding in here to deal with that?
So for this fiscal year coming up, we have $135.5 million to replace 3,700 poles, and the power system is diligently working on those issues.
So is that a yes?
Yes, well, we're planning to do 3,700 deteriorated poles. I think that's the most we can do in 1 year, so this program will continue year over year on our power system reliability.
Okay. And how long do we expect until we've sort of fully ameliorated the problem?
On the fix-it tickets, I believe it's 12 months is the level 2 tickets that Power System is actively managing through staff and contracts. But there's constantly always going to be reviews of our inspections to say, here's some new things that you need to put into your pipeline for fixes.
Because I thought the issue was that we weren't aware that there are so many of these poles that are deteriorating rapidly, and then we had that horrible accident and the cost of all of that, human cost and financial cost, and that there are a lot of power poles in that same situation. Do we have a full inventory at this point of those poles?
All the poles that had a level 1 fix-it ticket were fixed by May 16th, and all customers that were impacted were notified, and then the level 2
I guess I don't know
requires 12 months.
when you say it, and it's just because I don't know all the lingo, but a level 1 fix-it ticket, level 2 fix-it ticket, that means somebody reported it.
Yes.
But that's not necessarily an assessment of all of the poles that are out there, right? Or do we assess all those poles, and so you can say, okay, we know that there's this many that are.
Yeah, so Councilman, under the CPUC regulation that we follow, all poles have to be visually inspected at least once a year, and then depending on the age of the pole, there are more regular and or less regular but more intrusive inspections, where you will sometimes do coring into the wooden poles to see if there's any rot or anything like that. We're fully compliant on inspections. As of May 16th, as Ann mentioned, we also cleared the backlog of all of the poles that present an imminent threat to public safety as determined by the inspector that goes out in the field. And we're clearing any backlog that exists in the less severe but still significant priority 2 violation work that needs to be remedied. So as for inspections, we're now fully compliant. We're confident we have a handle on which poles are actually in a bad state, and now that we've cleared the backlog, we're also compliant with our policy of addressing the imminent safety threats within 24 hours.
Great.
Looking long-term, the review in 2016 proposed a pole replacement of $5,000 a year. DWP feels that by focusing on cross arms and other components, they can solve reliability issues faster, and feel that the level of 3,700 poles is appropriate. That has to be judged over a period of time as to whether or not that's adequate.
Okay, thank you. And then next is sort of a 2-part question, and I asked the previous panel a little bit about Operation Next. I'm interested in trying to see that happen faster than is currently scheduled for ultimately 2058. So I wanted to know the status of Operation Next and how this budget reflects our goals for that policy, and if you could describe the partnership between DWP and city agencies to capture and retain the stormwater.
LADWP is currently developing the Operation Next Master Plan to independently evaluate a range of project scenarios, potential partnerships, and major milestones to maximize water reuse in the city's Hyperion Water Reclamation Plan. Their master plan is anticipated to be completed by mid-2024. Additionally, LA Sand and DWP are collectively developing a programmatic environmental impact report for Operation Next and the Hyperion 2035 program. The purpose of the CEQA document is to inform the public and decision makers about the potential significant impact of a project and the ways the impact can be mitigated or avoided before the project is considered for approval. The notice of preparatory scoping period was completed in April of 2021, and the next opportunity for comment will be when the draft programmatic EIR is released to the public, currently anticipated on Q4 of 2024. Findings from Operation Next, the master plan will be incorporated into the programmatic EIR. So approximately $157.4 million of costs for Operation Next are included in the capital plan for fiscal years 24 through fiscal years 28 for the department. And right now, the total preliminary program cost is approximately $17 billion and will be evaluated when more details are available.
Okay. So one other on water. The council, we requested more investments on groundwater conveyance from MWD. And does this budget that you have assume greater investments from MWD, or we?
The stormwater capture projects and those. So those, they are planned. They provide multiple benefits for the city. As far as the exact dollar amount of these, I don't have the exact dollar amount, but I can provide that.
But we're assuming those investments.
Yes, we're assuming those investments of stormwater capture, working with other city departments, Park and Rec and the Bureau of Engineering, to move these projects forward.
Okay. And last one, the city, we're moving forward toward electrification of all of our city buildings and vehicles and equipment. We made major investments in that in this year's budget. How is DWP working with the city, and is that work reflected in your budget? Because what we put in was meant to leverage a lot more out of DWP than you might have otherwise been thinking of. So hopefully you saw the budget and said, okay, we got to add a lot more into our budget to account for what you guys are doing.
DWP coordinates activities and provides technical guidance to other city departments as part of the EV task force coordinated by the mayor's office. LATWP's budget includes over $39 million in funding for city transportation electrification projects through memorandums of understanding with General Services Division, Department of Transportation, Sanitation, Harbor, and the Bureau of Street Lighting. LADWP's EV Service Design Group in the Power Systems New Business Group coordinates and assists all city departments that require new electrical service or utility site upgrades to facilitate the installation of EVs, chargers on city-owned properties for fleet, the public, and employees. Examples include the Blue LA project managed by LADOT and the Green Meadows at the Rec and Park location that was previously done. And we do have a list of MOUs and dollar amounts. Harbor has $13.5 billion LADOT bus electrification. This is the MOU amount is $10 million and expires during the 23-24 year. General Services, $4.5 million for this year. And the LA Department of Transportation, a little less than $3 million.
So, and I appreciate all that, and those are good numbers to have. After seeing the city budget with all the investments we're making in the decarb, and that we plan on leveraging LADWP, were there changes that had to be made, or was that already?
There was no changes between our preliminary budget and our final budget. I think there's a close working relationship.
Okay. All right, that's good to know as well. I'll look into that. Thank you.
Councilmember McCosker.
Thank you. This one's a little out of left field. You ready? Don't worry, no math. Although you probably wouldn't mind if I had a math question. Probably not a budget question, but it does affect the bottom line. One of the things that I'm going to be thinking about in the coming year is subsidizing the water rates for community farms, especially in low-income neighborhoods. And we have all these community places where we provide land or opportunities to gain land in food deserts where folks are growing foods, and the water, not for reasons unrelated to us, outside of our control, is increasingly more expensive. And it's defeating the purpose and making it more difficult to achieve the purpose of these community farmers. What does it take to take a look at those rates, and what procedurally happens to create a special rate for community farms?
To create a subsidized rate, I think there would have to be a change to Proposition 218, or seeking the state or federal government for subsidies. There is now a low-income water discount that customers get, so if that could be applied to a community farm in a underserved community, maybe that would be another way to pursue that, because there is state money.
Looking at the low income rate for the individual consumer, but applying it to maybe a collective effort at a farm, you think that might work?
If it was given.
I see a no. I see a shaking head.
The recent litigation is less and less favorable under 218.
So a charter vote of the people doesn't help us?
We're entering city attorney advice kind of land, so I want to tread a little bit carefully, but
Sure.
in a general sense, the advice that I've gotten in the past is you have to treat all consumers that you're giving any kind of preferential rate treatment in a like way. And so I think we're going to have to be very careful about how we would structure that and how finely you can slice the onion. If you're giving it to community gardens, is that an agricultural rate, and is that eligible for other farming sorts of uses that might be occurring in the city? We should regroup with your office and the city attorney to
Let's
explore
work
that
together.
question. Yeah.
And we should do everything carefully. Thanks.
Okay, no more questions. Thank you all so much. Really appreciate the very thorough briefings. So we're going to consider this report noted and filed, but we have to vote on it. So would you please take
So,
a vote?
Madam Chair, we're voting on items 1 and 2 to note and file both of them.
We need to vote on both of them because we didn't vote on the last
Councilmember Yaroslavsky,
one. Yes.
Councilmember McCosker,
Yes.
Councilmember Rahman, Councilmember Blumenfield,
Blumenfield, aye.
Councilmember Hernandez. You have 3 ayes, and items 1 and 2 are noted and filed.
Wonderful. So next, we have item number 8. CLA, would you please read the item? Thank you.
You got it. Item number 8 is an Office of Petroleum and Natural Gas Administration and Safety Report relative to the status of ongoing oil amortization studies and related matters. You're not done yet.
I'm very pleased to welcome Erica Blyther, Administrator of the Office of Petroleum and Natural Gas Administration and Safety, to present us this item. Her office is overseeing what I see as the most groundbreaking environmental activities underway across the United States. She's charting the course for how quickly we can phase out oil extraction here in LA. Every single council district in the city has oil activity in it, and I'm very interested in finding legally defensible ways to end oil drilling in neighborhoods as fast as humanly possible. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Blyther for your presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, honorable members of City Council. And I realize I'm the only thing standing between you and the Memorial Day weekend, so I really thank you for your time and attention today. So thank you for the beautiful introduction. Again, my name is Erica Blyther with the Office of Petroleum and Natural Gas Administration and Safety. I'm the Petroleum Administrator. And throughout the process of developing the city's land use ordinance and nonconforming land use, the Office of Petroleum and Natural Gas has been working very closely with Department of City Planning. And one thing that came up in the Planning and Land Use Committee meeting was to have quarterly updates on the amortization study. So this is the first of the quarterly updates, and there's going to be a lot of background information. I can answer any questions throughout or at the end, as your preference. So today we're going to cover history and background, oil wells, drill sites in production, Enviroscreen 4.0, land use ordinance and amortization study, chronological timeline of the amortization studies, scope of work and deliverables, approach used by each contractor, budget, and the expected schedule. So how did we get here? Well, back in April of 2017, Council File 170447 was introduced by then Council President Wesson, and it was to report back on the feasibility of amending current city land use codes in connection with health impacts at oil and gas wells and drill sites. So the Board of Public Works, Office of Petroleum and Natural Gas Administration and Safety staff conducted an extensive inventory of oil and gas facilities within the city of Los Angeles, participated in a public hearing at the Los Angeles City Health Commission, collected historical records from multiple private and public databases, held dozens of meetings with numerous agencies, and retained a consultant to study the potential health impacts at oil and gas wells and drill sites within the city of Los Angeles. On July 29, 2019, the office produced the groundbreaking, almost 62,000-page report, Oil and Gas Health Report on Land Use Codes. And that's currently, it was and still is in the council file, 170447. The report provided an analysis of oil in Los Angeles, existing health literature, including LA County Public Health Oil and Gas Report, and the findings recommended analyzing the feasibility of a setback distance, which is a distance within which something is prohibited, at 1,500 feet from sensitive receptors, which are defined as populations with heightened risks of negative health outcomes due to exposure. Throughout 2020 and 2021, numerous council meetings were held as the city council motion and report moved through designated committees. The conversation evolved from setback distances to non-conforming land use overall. And this shows some of the committee meetings that it went to. Some of the committees were, at the time it was called Energy, Climate Change, and Environmental Justice Committee, Planning and Land Use, as well as Budget and Finance. And it was also scheduled for the Arts, Park, Health, Education, Neighborhoods, but it was waived from there as there are many members who were on those other committees. In November of 2021, the Budget and Finance Committee moved to concur with the April 2021 Plum Committee recommendations as amended, and the council file was forwarded to the full City Council for consideration. On January 26, 2022, the city unanimously adopted the Budget and Finance Committee report, which included the following: instruct the Department of City Planning with the assistance of City Attorney to prepare and present an ordinance to prohibit new oil and gas extraction and make extraction activities a non-conforming land use in all zones, and instruct the Office of Petroleum and Natural Gas Administration and Safety to hire an expert to conduct an amortization period study for existing wells. But to understand amortization, we first have to understand oil. So the earliest known uses of oil in Los Angeles were by Native Americans. And I'd like to thank my staff for digging deep into these historical records or finding some of these pictures. The First Nations, Tongva, and Gabrielino tribes used naturally forming asphalt and bitumen for glue to affix tools to arrowheads, watertight sealants for baskets and canoes, and decorative shell inlay, as well as playing games similar to dice. The road used to collect petroleum leading from the village of Yagna to the La Brea tar pits in the ocean is today known as Wilshire Boulevard. In the late 1800s, oil was discovered in Los Angeles, and Edward Doheny kicked off the first oil boom in 1892 with the discovery of a gusher and present-day Echo Park. And the story I've heard is that he slyly noticed that someone's wagon wheels had oil on them, and he asked to trace it back. He's like, "Oh, where'd you go today?" And he traced it back and found the oil gusher that way. In the 1890s and 1920s, there was a huge amount of production in Los Angeles, and these are pictures of Los Angeles. Some of the things in the background are trees, but a lot more are oil derricks. At one point, Los Angeles produced 25% of the world's oil. This picture might be very familiar to you. This was in City Hall. And this is Playa del Rey in the 1920s. And this is Huntington Beach in 1927. Even after more than a century of prolific production, the U.S. Geological Survey estimates that 1.6 billion barrels of recoverable oil remain in place beneath the city, rivaling the reserves of the Middle Eastern countries like Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Kuwait 14,000 miles away. Today, the city has 26 oil and gas fields that intersect city boundaries. There's 16 active or idle drill sites across the city, as well as oil operations in industrial areas zoned M3. There are approximately 5,273 oil and gas wells, approximately 660 active, 1,295 idle, and 3,282 plugged. And it's very important to note dates, as these numbers are constantly changing due to economic considerations. So some of these wells are getting plugged, some are idle and turning back to active, and some are being, there's a lot of changes going on with these numbers. Approximately 67% of oil and gas wells are within drill sites, and the other 33% are outside of drill sites. As was earlier mentioned, there are oil and gas facilities in nearly every section of the 103 square miles of the city. And as some of these terms are confusing, And I just wanted to go over a few, and I'm going to do this quickly because I know this is a lot of definitions to read. But oil fields are actually sandstone reservoirs that were formed approximately 2.5 to 23 million years ago. Drill sites are facilities where oil and gas operations occur. Oil and gas is a type of well, and wells can be oil wells and also sometimes injection wells. Idle wells are wells that have not been used for production or injection for 6 consecutive months or more in 2 years, but are capable of being reactivated. A plugged well has been abandoned and permanently plugged or sealed with cement plug in compliance with current regulations. This is also sometimes called capped or sealed. And oil terminology is unique, so in this case, abandoned is positive. Abandonment usually means permanent closure and sealing of a well by placing cement and or other materials in the well bore or casing as specified in California laws or regulations. A buried well is one that's historic and predates current records. New or permitted well is one that is newly drilled or may still just be in the permitting phase. And canceled is a well permit that was canceled prior to the drilling of the well. Abeyance represents a well held in abeyance. Orphan wells are ones where there's no operator or other responsible party to pay for the closing, and sometimes they're also known as orphan wells or idle deserted wells, which are the responsibility of the state to plug and abandon. And this is some other terminology that sometimes you'll see in the wells. Unknown is the one, meaning usually there's no information. This is pre-1976. When looking at oil operators, there are different ways to look at the data. It's interesting to note for all well types, and this includes the active, the idle, and the plugged, and that's the 5,273, 2.7% of the operators are associated with 61% of the wells, 42% of the operators are associated with 33% of the wells, and 55% of the operators are associated with 6% of the wells. And looking at this another way, for all the well types, including again the active, idle, and plugged, 2/3 of the wells are associated with the 16 largest operators, and 1/3 of the wells are associated with 1,957 different operators. So there are some operators, about 319 operators, that have a single well. So there are many, many operators historically within the city of Los Angeles. Now looking just now at the active wells, of the currently active wells in Los Angeles, you can see the main operators are Warren E&P with 171 active wells, E&B Natural Resources with 141 active wells, Tidelands with 92 active wells, Southern California Gas Company 57 active wells, Pacific Coast Energy with 40 active wells, and the list goes on and on. One thing to note is that neither the study nor the ordinance covers wells regulated by the California Public Utilities Commission, and this is per the subsection of Los Angeles Municipal Code Section 1301, except for any well operated by a public utility regulated by the California Public Utilities Commission. So although Southern California gas wells are here, they're not actually part of the study. Now, including the idle and active wells, you can see the largest operators, again, Warren E&P, E&B Natural Resources, Tidelands. And both these active and idle wells have the potential to be turned on producing oil and gas. And this is showing the top 22 operators that have at least 20 active or idle wells. And we have a lot more data on many more. This is just giving you the first overview. For distribution per council district, the oil follows the geology. So you can see where there are historic and currently active wells throughout the city. This is a picture of some of the neighborhood drill sites and where they're located. And this picture doesn't show the Wilmington Harbor area in Council District 15 where the majority of oil and gas infrastructure is located. But there is a map. It's a little bit harder to see, but this was also included in the council file as part of the frequently asked questions. And the CD15 drill sites are included in this map. The 16 neighborhood drill sites, this includes the names, council districts, and operator of the drill site. So this is 17 because Jefferson was recently abandoned and a lot of people still think of Jefferson. So Allen Cove is idle in Council District 1, Murphy in Council District 10, West Pico in Council District 5, Rancho Park, Council District 5, Hillcrest Country Club in Council District 5, San Vicente in Council District 5, Packard in CD10, Mission Visco, CD12, Aliso Canyon, CD12, Filipino Town, CD13, Echo Park, CD13, Broadway in CD14, Harbor Gateway 1, CD15, Harbor Gateway 2, CD15, Jogan, CD15, and Warren E&P in CD15. So all the information that I was able to just go through, you can find this in City Planning's oil well dashboard. So the well counts, the operator names, and the locations can be found in this. So as I mentioned, this Department of City Planning as well as Office of Petroleum and Gas have been working closely together. And LA City Planning has created an oil well GIS dashboard. The source of the data is from the State Office of Oil and Gas, CalGEM. And City Planning has GIS resources and data, including this dashboard, and it's capable of reproducing and expanding city oil well data that's useful for the oil and gas drilling ordinance, and it's useful for the amortization studies. The links are here, and they're accessible to anyone. And this is, I'm not going to actually demonstrate the dashboard, but you can kind of see some of the sections. There are 14 sections with various aspects of data. So there are maps of the wells, including showing the density, as well as wells by council district. So all this is available to everyone. Yeah, it's a very nice tool. So I was really happy that City Plan was able to come up with this, and they allowed me to discuss it and share it with everyone, because I think it's a useful tool.
Thank you so much, Ms. Blyther. I have a couple questions, and I'll open it up to my colleagues. So once the work is completed on the first study, how will that study be transmitted, and is it, I assume it's going to be publicly made available too?
I have not finished my presentation. I'm not sure if.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
I wasn't sure if you, I was going to go through some more.
My bad, yeah.
I'm going to go through.
That was your fault. You took a breath.
I'm trying to fly through this data. I timed it, which I made my staff do a dry run. It was 20 minutes. I was like, okay, I'm going to keep that 20 minutes. So I just wanted to go through a little bit more, and I'm going to go into really in-depth studies about the amortization itself, but I just wanted to let you know some of the tools are available. Now, some of this that's not available currently is on the, this is coming from CalGEM. This is some of the work that my staff and the contractors have been working on. And this is oil production by drill site. So you can see number one, again, who is producing the most oil. So this is Warren, followed by San Vicente, followed by Packard. And then in terms of natural gas, the top gas producers, number one in this case is Packard, followed by San Vicente and West Pico. CalEnviroScreen, everyone might be familiar with it, but CalEnviroScreen is a science-based mapping tool developed by the California Office of Environmental Health Hazard Assessment, and it uses environmental, health, and socioeconomic information to produce a numerical score for each census tract in the state. The results are depicted on maps so that different communities can be compared to one another. CalEnviroScreen 4.0 uses the latest version and uses 21 indicators covering pollution sources and the drivers of vulnerability within California's approximately 8,000 census tracts to measure the overall cumulative burdens affecting California communities. And so the Office of Petroleum and Natural Gas has gone ahead and ranked all of the drill sites by the CalEnviroScreen. We're not showing all of them, we're showing the top 10. And of the 16 sites, 8 are in or around low-income and disadvantaged communities, subject to the highest CalEnviro score. And a higher score in this case is the worst. What would have been, again, Jefferson's on here, was recently abandoned. What would be the new number 10 would be Packard Drill Site in Council District 10. So get into the specifics of the land use amortization study. In December of 2022, the Los Angeles City Council adopted Ordinance 187709, which deemed all existing drill sites illegally non-conforming land use, and it's for, except for any well operated again by the California Public Utilities Commission, or regulated, excuse me, by the California Public Utilities Commission. And so what is amortization? Under the concept of amortization, a local government can move to declare an economic activity non-compliant with zoning codes and then require a company to stop that economic activity once it has recouped its investment. And this is our Valentine from the LA Business Journal. Local oil companies look to fight drilling bans. So this is the work that's been done so far. Since January, when council instructed the office to hire experts with a budget of $3.5 million, the Board of Public Works approved an RFP release in April of 2022 with a deadline of May 10th. We received 3 proposals, again working with city planning to select bidders. We actually selected all 3 because their combined approaches met the city's needs and schedule. The Board of Public Works approved the award of contracts on December 2nd, 2022. The Mayor's Office approval was obtained January 18th, was heard back at the Board of Public Works January 27th. City Attorney signatures on February 27th for all 3 contractors, and Board of Public Works signatures and contract numbers on March 1st. And that was for 2 of them because we had some insurance issues on the last one. We issued notice proceeds on March 1st, kickoff meeting March 2nd for Baker and O'Brien, March 9th with CJM, and insurance issues were resolved in April, and contract numbers shortly thereafter. So at this point, we've held kickoff meetings with every contractor, and they're all under contract. And there was a mistake in the I think the record on the council file, I think it said April 9th was the kickoff meeting, it was actually March 9th. Expected deliverables from each contractor are draft reports, recommendations, slide presentations with approximately 6 to 12 presentations, and then a final draft report within 30 days of receipt of comments from city staff. Also presentations of the final findings with city staff at board meetings in Los Angeles City Council, and up to 5 city council meetings if necessary. And I'm going to go into details for each of the contract's specific approaches. A&M, also known as Alvarez and Marcel, uses an income approach to determine the appropriate amortization time period, including economic life expectancy, based on engineering-based reserve life, forward market prices, asset retirement costs, royalty overrides, and regulatory requirements, as well as operating expenses. This approach will consider various scenarios of flex market prices, drilling costs, regulatory, environmental costs, and asset retirement costs. This timeline is 5 months. And you can see the schedule for this. And what makes this approach unique is that it's a sweeping panoramic overview of modeling. And all the approaches are modeling to some degree, but this is a little bit broader. And LA City experience in the past was they were able to help us with the SoCalGas valuation study, enabling the new 2022 franchise agreement. This is for a fixed cost of $250,000, 50% a draft report, 50% after the remaining successful completion. The next contractor is Baker & O'Brien, and their approach proposed a series of 25 studies, and each study has approximately 60 to 100 wells. And it begins with a pilot study that considers the highest priority wells, and each study will include an income model that will determine time at which oil and gas production price revenues, less operating costs and royalties, will provide a return on investment. And this time frame is 18 months, 5 months for the pilot study, about 6 months for studies 2 through 5, and Part C, studies 6 through 25 will be 7 months. This is the schedule as well as budget. And it's approximately $2.2 million. And this is a very intensive, extensive well-by-well analysis. Baker & O'Brien has assisted various California agencies, and this name may be familiar because they completed the Culver City amortization study, and they have an expert in the area on the team. CJM is a similarly intensive approach of well-by-well data, and they're going to also have a pilot study, a full-scale evaluation, and one thing that they're also doing is digitizing pre-1976 data from CalGEM, and so that's actually looking at the historic records and making sure that we're able to capture information for that. So the timeline, the cost is approximately $594,000. And what's unique about this is there's a visualization dashboard made of SQL and Power BI, and it's similar to the Department of City Planning's dashboard, but it will house the production data as well as when the study's complete amortization data. And so we have access to that for 36 months. And so this is a working dashboard that's available at this link. And this is instructions to use it, and this is what it looks like as an overview. And again, currently it has its production data, but we will have access to this for 36 months, and this will add more of the amortization data as well. And so in conclusion, the city will have various study approaches and dynamic visualization tools to aid tracking, analysis, and public engagement. The Office of Petroleum and Natural Gas worked with the Department of City Planning, selecting all 3 bidders as their combined approach met the city's needs and schedule without exceeding the project budget. The benefit of having 3 contractors is that this approach enables the city to view the solution from multiple lenses. It also provides the city with flexibility. There is value in comparing the different approaches. The combined findings, conclusions, and recommendations will offer a comprehensive perspective for the development of future policy. In essence, we're going to study every active and idle well in the city, each viewed from 3 different approaches. This is the overall budget. And so you can see the timelines. A&M is projected to be done by October of 2023. The others are projected to be done by October of 2024. And again, we will have the license use through March of 2026 for that dashboard. There's a contingency, so the overall budget is $3.5 million. This is just under $3.1 million, and there's a contingency of about $400,000. And this was bid prior to the return to in-person meetings, and 2 of these firms are based in Texas, as there's a lot more oil and gas work there. Some of this contingency could be used for travel expenses, as well as if there are any issues discovered with the data at the end. And I did attach a frequently asked questions to the council file. I don't know if it's worth it to go through a few now, or if you had your own questions or had a chance to review, but some are just basic questions, such as what is the amortization study as it applies to oil wells? How could results of the amortization study affect the ordinance? what does the amortization study include? And does it take into account the health impact? As far as the health impact, that's been done by the office. We did it to some extent, and then also the County Public Health Department is also continuing to do health studies. So that's not something that this is within the scope. Currently, we are looking at the return on investment because that's what an amortization study is. Now I'll open up to questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So just so I'm clear, once you have these three different ways of assessing amortization period, is it going to end up being a well-specific analysis, or is it going to be an average across-the-board analysis to determine what the amortization period is?
We think they're going to be different amortization periods because it's based on, they're different oil properties. So some of the oil costs more, some of it's heavier, some of it goes for a different market value. People bought equipment at different times, so we're looking at all those factors. So there could be that some of the wells, which have been operated by the same operator, could have a similar amortization period, but other wells operated by a different operator with a different quality of oil could have a different amortization period. We suspect there are going to be different types of amortization periods depending on what's happening at
Sure.
different sites.
You also noted at the beginning that 2/3 of the wells are operated by a very small percentage of very large corporations. It seems like perhaps they're more efficient in terms of, so anyway, it's really interesting. Quickly, so once the work is complete on the first study, how will that study be transmitted? Is it going to be available to the public? What's the rollout going to be?
So the idea behind this is really to have a comprehensive picture to guide policy. The timeline is 18 months for everything, so the idea was to give updates, but we wanted to make sure as we're working through this process that we are completing a complete record. So the idea is prior to possibly acting on some of this is to wait until the full study comes out and then identify any issues. We haven't discussed as much of if we're going to roll it out, but we are planning to have maybe at the end everything's going to be available. It's just what's going to happen in the intermediary, which I guess is the question.
Great. You touched a little bit on Cal EnviroScreen, but how do the amortization studies take into account proximity to neighborhoods and other sensitive uses and other prioritization criteria, if at all? Or is it really focused on the operations rather than what's around?
We, as I mentioned, we are going to look at every well in the city. So we're starting with some, but we're going to get to all of them. We are looking at starting with ones that we actually are looking at starting kind of a cross-section across the city. And so we're looking at, of course, in Council District 15, where there are a lot of environmental impacts. It was one of the AB 617 communities for the first year. And we're looking at a cross-section across the city, but we're picking a few different wells. But our plan is to get to all of them.
Okay, great. And that's within that 18-month period?
Yes, everything will be done within the 18 months. Well, that's projected.
Amazing.
I get too bold with that title. Timeframe.
Just one more question. Are there other pathways to ensure that we're closing down oil extraction operations in neighborhoods as quickly as possible besides this amortization path, or is this really where, as a city, we're focused right now?
That's kind of a question for city planning, but city planning does have a process that's called a nuisance abatement proceeding, and that's under the Zoning Administrator Code, Los Angeles Municipal Code Section 1227.1, and that's something that can be done, and they look at things related to if there's adverse effects to public health, if there are repeated nuisances, if it's adversely affecting nearby uses, and so the city planning department is able to do that using that procedure.
We're going through that right now with the Pico drill site. Thank you so much, Ms. Blyther. Colleagues, questions? Councilmember McCosker, Bloomfield?
Great, thank you, good to see you. A couple questions. The cost for these studies, are we bearing that, or is that somehow, are we able to charge that to the oil wells in some way?
It was allocated in the budget. I had not heard about reimbursement procedures, but it was in the UB, and it's been moved into the Board of Public Works funds, so we are paying for that. I don't know if that's how it was originally set aside.
And then is there a downside to doing the three in that, I mean, it seems to make sense, but of course, we're going to be sued and everything, and the oil companies will probably push for whatever the study is. In some ways, we're giving them a range, and they're going to push for the top of the range. Whereas if we had just identified what it is, then we might not have to. It seems like we're doing all this, but ultimately they're going to benefit because they're going to get to pick the longest number. Is that right?
Well, we think it's going to vary depending on the oil well and the history for each individual oil well. So well that was developed in the 1970s could be very different from one that's from the 1950s. So we're going to look at all that economic data.
But the three different approaches are that they're all looking at the same data, but through different lenses, right?
Exactly. One is a broader one is a little bit far more focused on the individual well level activity. We've considered the idea of asking the operators for their information too and getting some feedback. They might have their own costs that we just don't have access to, so we're considering asking for that, but we're planning to do that at the end of the studies rather than throughout the process. But we're trying to see how we can make sure we're having a comprehensive picture of what's happening so that it's not again, we want to have a defensible record for whatever we go
Shouldn't
through.
we do that before they see our studies? Because once they see our studies, then they're going to give us the information that makes it seem more expensive, but they may be more reluctant if we've done a study and if their numbers would be less advantageous.
We can consider asking for it sooner. We can do that.
I mean,
if they're willing to provide
you're
it.
the expert in this. I'm not. I'm just,
Yeah.
a poker player, and it seems like we don't want to show our hand until we've seen theirs. Okay, and then the middle study is three times more expensive, and I assume that's because it's a broader look.
Yeah, it's going to be a very intense look at the well data, and it is something that this company has had some experience with dealing with litigation issues in the past. I mean, I was very honest with all of them. I said, hey, this is very likely going to be under legal review as this happens, so be prepared. And so these people have dealt with some of that in the past, so they commanded a high price. They were working with Culver City during their amortization process as they worked with Sentinel Peak Resources. So that's something that had been requested from previous members of City Council, was to have a similar approach to what was done in Culver City. So that's what was delivered.
Okay, great, thank you.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Thanks very much for being here. And thanks for the report. I'd love to get a full set of everything too. And probably take it out in community every once in a while, especially in Wilmington where we have so many wells. I know that in the budget we put some contractual as needed services in. I think we're using the Special Amenities Fund. Do you have, and I think you can fill that position, do you have the staffing that you need to sort of take this on? Because when these reports come back, it's going to be a lot of work, a lot of review, a lot of effort.
We're doing what we can. I am down one person. One person took another position. Unfortunately, I lost a person. There's someone who's done a lot of work but currently is on maternity leave, so she's great, but currently not able to provide support to this. Hopefully she'll be back in July. We'll see. We'll make it work.
This is a very big investment, both financially and politically, for everybody to have it not be staff to analyze. So will you step up and raise your hand when you need staffing to make sure we can cover this?
Yes, I did request staffing in the last budget. Don't think we got anything, but hopefully we will. Yes, I'll definitely raise a warning as we need help.
Okay. Do we have a number? My sense is that there are a number of orphaned, improperly closed wells that are actually inaccessible. My experience has been that there are wells that we find when we take down a piece of property for redevelopment, and we're discovering more every time we do a development project, especially in the harbor area. What's the strategy for that? Because we could go through all this work and still have many, many orphaned and improperly closed wells, which are themselves a danger.
Yeah, so that is a big issue, is the orphan well, the wells. So the city has built on oil wells throughout history and continues to do so. It is a big issue. The state does an extensive process to find out the chain of title, et cetera, looking to see is there anyone who could pay for this well to be properly abandoned. Once they perform that search and see that there's no one, they take on the responsibility. But it's an issue because it takes time to do that. The state was allocated federal funds from the Investment and Jobs Act, and so they were able to get some money to do some certain abandonments. They've actually gone through an orphan well prioritization process, and so they've submitted some, they worked with the local governments. I was able to participate in some of the meetings, and they have a set of priority wells. But for wells that are under buildings, that's really a difficult situation. But they are prioritizing orphan wells and idle deserted wells, and there is some funding coming to the city of Los Angeles related to that. Not to us directly, but it's going to be allocated to the state to do that abandonment work.
Well, that's important to know. We've had the experience in the harbor area, particularly of trying to build affordable housing, and we have found wells on sites, and it has increased the cost of housing because of the improperly closed wells, and it would be very helpful to know that we're fully utilizing available funds from the feds subvented through the state.
It's an issue with development because depending on the age of the well and how well it was abandoned, of course, the standards today are not what they used to be. In the past, people would just throw telephone poles, rocks, whatever. They think, okay, it looks solid.
Right.
Those are not necessarily sealing off the zones of different, the oil, the water, any of those zones are not properly being sealed off. Now the standards are very, very intensive, and they're regulated by the State Office of Oil and Gas, CalGEM, and it's all about sealing off the zone of fresh water, oil areas, and making sure that there are no leaks and things. So it's a very different process, and it's much more expensive now than it used to be.
And just this, you might not be able to predict this, but when we are successful with closing down active well sites that are in residential areas, do you expect that the technology and the techniques will be such that it'll be cost effective for folks to move further out and do whatever they call it now, slant drilling or location drilling, and get to the same oil site to extract?
So you mean like someone coming from outside of the city to come into the city to get the reserve?
Yeah.
That's a good question. I know LA County has also taken up a motion to have oiled, no longer non-conforming land use. They have the similar time frame we do, 20 years. Long Beach has not been the same, so I don't know for sure, but LA County as well as LA City are the similar time frame.
Last question, sorry. Now I'm the only one coming between you and Memorial Day. I have had some experiences of talking to folks who have active sites where the sites are producing very, very, very little. In fact, they're barely breaking even and maybe even losing money because they're almost dry or almost tapped out or whatever, however you would call it. But it's so much more expensive to close a site, properly cap a site, than it is just to operate at a loss. What's the strategy there?
So another thing that this office was tasked with in 170447 was to come up with a plan to properly remediate wells within 3 to 5 years of them ceasing production. So we've been having interviews with the LA City Fire Department, which deals with oil well closures, the State Office of Oil and Gas, and we have some meetings scheduled with Department of Toxic Substances Control and others to look at how can we ensure that sites are properly closed. And it's a big concern. Currently, the well bonding is about $10,000 per well. That's not nearly enough. It can cost up to $250,000 to $500,000 depending on the age of the well to close these wells. So the fire department's looking to raise the bonds right now, and so there's an oil well unit that's focused on that. There are a lot of different things we're working on. No concrete answers, but we are working, and we are aware this can be a big issue.
Thank you. Thank you. I can imagine, last thing I'll say is I can imagine your effort has been going on for some period of time, and new councils come and go, but the effort remains. I just want to assure you that I am thoroughly and completely and 1,000% committed to having this effort be successful.
Thank you so much. I really do appreciate that. Thank you all for your time and attention.
Thank you so much. Questions? No questions, okay. Seeing no other questions, we'll consider this report received. We need to vote on it?
Yes, Madam Chair. Councilmember Slapski?
Yes.
Councilmember McCosker?
Yes.
Councilmember Rahman? Councilmember Blumenfield? Aye. Councilmember Hernandez? You have 3 ayes. The item is noted and filed.
Wonderful, that concludes our agenda. Mr. Clerk, are there any other items before us today?
The desk is clear, Madam Chair.
Wonderful, have a great Memorial Day weekend, everyone. Thank you so much.